Morning and welcome everybody. It's right at the top of the hour, 11 o'clock if you're in Eastern Time, morning or afternoon depending on where you may be located. Welcome to our Office 365 External Sharing webinar. Let's start with some quick introductions. My name is Peter Carson. I'm the president of Extranet User Manager and Envision IT. I'm also a SharePoint MVP and a partner seller with Microsoft Canada. All my contact details are here, and we're going to be posting a copy of the slide deck up on our site after the webinar, so you can always pull that down for our full information. Broader set of leadership team here at Extranet User Manager. Also on the call, Logan Guest is going to be answering calls as we go through. We've got Dinesh, who runs the product team, is responsible for development of the Extranet User Manager product. Deb from a finance point of view, Amanda from an internal sales and marketing perspective. All right, so let's dive right into our agenda for the next hour or so. This is a somewhat new, somewhat old topic. There's been a lot of changes around external sharing, particularly with Ignite last month down in the US. So I want to go through, what are the new and interesting things that are going on out of the box from an Office 365 external sharing point of view? How do you administer those? Talk more about Office 365 groups. They've sort of got their own unique use case model around external sharing, and then take you through some demos and customer scenarios. We will have the Q&A open throughout. I won't be watching it myself, but other staff like Logan will be. So if you have questions through, feel free to post those in through there. If it's appropriate, we can certainly jump in. So Logan, go ahead and jump into the call if there's something that's relevant to the current topic that we're talking about at that point in time. All right, so what I want to start with is actually a blog article. We're putting up a new resource section in our Extranet User Manager site, and this is going to be one of the first blog articles going on, talking about 5 considerations for your extranet. I'm just kind of walk people through this. Before we get into the out-of-the-box experience, I want to kind of lay the ground in terms of what do you think about as you're looking to share your content with external users. So obviously the first thing is just who's going to be accessing the extranet, who's going to be coming in and using that content from an external point of view. And it depends on the type of organization that you are. Maybe it's a members portal, a customer portal, vendor portal, and board of directors is quite often, citizens, researchers, tenants. There's lots of different examples. These are just a few of the different scenarios there. But what you can tell just by the types of users coming in, I mean, any type of organization makes sense, whether they're a not-for-profit, for-profit, public sector, private sector, what have you. There's always that need to collaborate with people outside of your organization. So that's sort of the first consideration, is just thinking about who's going to be coming in and using what you're building here. The second one is around self-registration or invitation. And the idea here is, how are people going to come into the extranet? Will they already be known to you and you're going to invite them in? You've got a small known set of users. Think about the board of directors scenario from the previous slide. You know who your board is and you can invite them in. You can manage that centrally. You could delegate that to the board secretary. But if you get into hundreds or thousands of external users, that can become more challenging. You don't necessarily know who all those people are. So often we see the need for some sort of self-registration as part of that. And then that brings follow-on questions around that. Things like, well, who approves those users that are registering? Is there workflows around that approval? Is there auto approvals? If you can do things to simplify and automate things, that's always a great scenario. And we have a case study at the end in one of our customer scenarios that we're going to take you through that. Delegation as well, the idea that not one person or one group is responsible for approving all those. So how do those workflows work, and how does that delegation come in as part of that? So that's sort of the second thing to consider as you're looking at your extranet. The third option is then, Logan? Yep. Sure. Any better? Okay. Yeah, so the third option here is around how your extranet users are going to authenticate. Are they going to use an email and password, which is often what we see in a lot of traditional extranets? Are they going to come in with their Office 365 credentials, or under the hood, Azure AD? They're kind of one and the same. Do they have a Microsoft account, or maybe you want to use social identities, Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, to come into your extranet? And I'll talk more about which of these makes sense in an Office 365 out-of-the-box experience as we go through the session. And then what sort of interactions are your external users going to have? Are they strictly going to consume published content that you've put up on the extranet, or are they actually going to collaborate? Is this more of a publishing group and a communications tool, or is it a collaborative space like a team site where they're going to actually work with you on documents, edit them themselves, maybe upload their own documents into there? Do they have team or project sites that they need to access, or maybe they need to become full-fledged members of Office 365 groups? And we'll talk more about what a 365 group is and what that would mean. And then the last consideration to think about is what applications are they going to be coming into? Is it just Office 365? Well, even saying just, there's a lot of components to that. Is it SharePoint Online and OneDrive for Business, which is what we traditionally think of from an external sharing point of view? Or are they coming into the full groups experience? Or are there other apps, things like Power BI, Stream for video, Power Apps and Flow for forms and workflows that they need to access? Maybe there's an on-premises SharePoint, some third-party software as a service applications, or maybe you've built your own custom applications that you want to expose up, whether those are on-premise or in the cloud. So these are all things that you need to think about as you're looking at building out your extranet. So let's take the example now of zeroing in and say, well, you've decided from a technology point of view you want to use Office 365 and external sharing out of the box. What does that limit us down to? When we look at those 5 scenarios of who's coming in, how do they come in? Are they self-registered invitation? How do they authenticate, interactions, applications? It narrows it down a little bit. Obviously, any type of external user can come in and use the out-of-the-box experience, so that's not a restriction. There is no self-registration out of the box in the Office 365 external sharing, so it does require you to be using an invitation-only model, and that's really what it's built around. And that makes a lot of sense in some scenarios and not so much in others, and we'll talk about the decisions around that. How are your users going to authenticate? Well, there's really only 2 choices with Office 365 out of the box. Either they're already Office 365 users themselves. It can create an Azure AD account under the hood for them if need be, or they can use their Microsoft account, like their Hotmail or Outlook.com account to come in. Those are really our only options coming in out of the box. Interactions that they're going to have, well, they can interact with any of the different components of Office 365, but that's really the extent of it. There are some additional things you can do with Azure AD to get into SaaS applications, custom applications, but that's certainly not out of the box. There's a fair bit of work involved in getting that all together and working. All right, so what I want to do now is pull up a reference to Ignite. I mentioned Ignite happened, I guess, a little over a month ago now, and there are a ton of sessions there. There's 851 sessions available on demand. There's PowerPoint decks available. So if you haven't had a look through the resources there, I encourage you to. And in particular, I want to draw out one topic that I've actually drawn a fair bit of content from for today's talk. It's Eugene Lin, who's a principal program manager at Microsoft, talking about enabling external sharing and collaboration with OneDrive and SharePoint. So it's very much the topic for today. We're going to go further than the out-of-the-box experience, but I want to start from that point of view. So like I said, I want to give credit to him. We've actually used a number of his slides and concepts through here, and I want to take you through a number of the different scenarios. The first scenario is what they call simple external sharing. The idea here is that I just want to make it easy to share a document, either read-only or editable, with anybody. And I don't really care about making sure that it's secure. I don't need them to sign in or create an account. I don't even need to control who they forward it on to. Basically, if you get the email and the link, you can use that document. So that sounds like a big gaping security hole, but there's actually scenarios where this makes sense. Think about it when you attach a document to an email and send it. It's kind of the same scenario. You've got no control over who then forwards that document further from there. So basically, anybody who has access to that email has access to that document. The nice thing here is that you're not actually putting the document into the email itself, and all the issues that raises around multiple versions as that gets shared around through different people. It maybe get edited along the way. Everybody's pointing back to that single version of the truth back in SharePoint. So in the modern experience, and I'll take you through this in a minute once we've gone through a couple of these scenarios, it's actually pretty straightforward. You say, I want to share a document, a folder, a library, and it brings up this dialog on the left here, and I choose that anyone can use this link to either view or edit this document. You can see down at the bottom of the box, it has a checkbox as to whether I want to allow editing or not, and also if I want to set an expiration date. Maybe I only want to share this out for the next week or so. I can specify that date on there. Somebody gets that email after that date, they don't have access to the document. It's now locked out from that point of view. But basically, anyone who has access to that link is able to use it. So the recipient decides who else gets access because they can forward that on to anybody they choose, and anybody they forward it to automatically gets access as well. It's pretty guaranteed because there's no need to create an account or sign in or do anything with that. So it's very easy to share that through any medium. It doesn't have to be email, could be chat, could be social, could be Twitter. I mean, it's really up to you as to how you want to share that out from that point of view. If you think about your internal users on the left as part of Contoso and your external users on the right, I mean, basically anybody who has that link has access to that document. If they don't have the link, they don't have access to the document. So it is still controlled. You need to be part of that thread or that conversation, but you don't control where it goes from there. Anybody can forward it on from that point of view. Now, if you've enabled this on your site and other people will have the right to share links this way, you might want to know about this happening. So they actually put some notifications in around this, which is good. You want to know when somebody anonymously creates that link to a document that you manage and you own. You get an email when that occurs, and you can see exactly who shared it, what constraints are around it. Is it view only or editable? When does it expire? And you could even override that and say, you know what? I don't agree with that. I'm not comfortable with that. I'm actually going to remove that link. So it no longer works from that point of view. Obviously that needs to be a conversation, understand, well, why did they share it in the first place and why are you removing it? That's part of the communications around doing all this. Now, let's say instead of sharing externally, you actually want to send a link out to people in your organization. So this idea here is that you're not granting rights to the document, you're giving them a link that gives them rights to the document. So as long as they have that link, they have access to that document. Now it's locked to people within your organization, so it can't be forwarded to somebody outside. It has to be somebody within your organization. So if you think about the diagram of the people we had previously, I mean, that link can be shared out to somebody externally, but it's never going to work for them. It just doesn't allow external users to come in through that link. It's only for your staff. I like the way they describe it on the bottom right here. It's like a magic attachment that blocks external users. So think about a document that you want to share internally at Contoso. Maybe it's confidential. You don't want people sharing that document out. You give them an internal only link. They may choose to forward to anybody else within Contoso. Those folks are all staff, internal users. They can access that document. But if any one of them tries to send it externally to somebody outside the organization, it's not going to work for those people. Now they could still download the document, attach it, send it, but the actual link itself that is being created only works for staff. So it's an interesting concept there. Now, what about, okay, I want to share it with people externally, but I don't want it wide open. I want a specific person to be able to work with this. Maybe I'm working with an external legal counsel on a contract, and I only want that lawyer that I'm working with to have access to that contract document that's in our SharePoint site. So in this case, you can actually create an external link for specific people to say only these people can access this document. So we go through that same process, except now I choose that I want specific people, and those people don't have to be internal only users. It can be external users as well. So they need to be signed in with the account associated with who you've invited them in from. So if they're internal users, obviously they have to use their internal credentials. If they're guest external users, however they've been invited in, whatever that account is, if that's your lawyer's at his firm's email domain, that's the account that he needs to come in to use that. Now, it does require that guest user go through that process of accepting the invitation, and I'll walk you through what that process looks like a little bit later. And there's a number of different experiences that they go through as part of that. Now, you can also put what's called a one-time passcode in as part of that as well, and this can actually repeat over time. So if you say, well, I'm sharing this with my lawyer, I'm not that involved with them. I'm not sure if they're still with that law firm. It's been 6 months since I last worked with them. You can actually say, well, every month I need, before they use that link, for them to validate their email and say, yes, I still work for that organization. I'm still there. It still makes sense for me to collaborate with you on this document. That's always been a challenge with extranets is you invite people in and then staff changes within your partners and you don't know whether those people actually still work there or not, and did they still have access to the documents in your repository. If they control a username and password, that becomes very easy for them to continue to access even when they left that organization. Through this verification process, it confirms that no, they are still working there and still part of that organization. So when they accept that invitation, there's a couple different experiences. So I mentioned earlier on when we're looking at the out of the box, depending on what type of email you invite somebody in from, they're going to have a slightly different experience through there. Now they have to be either an Office 365, Azure AD, or a Microsoft account. Those are really the only options coming in. So let's say they are an Office 365 user. This is actually the best scenario. If you were to partner with me and you invited me in with my peter@envisionit.com email address, that email is already associated with my Office 365 tenant. I already have credentials. All that is set up already. When I accept that invitation from you, I just use my corporate credentials, same as if I was going to my own SharePoint site to access your SharePoint site. So it's actually a very seamless experience if the person you're inviting is already in Office 365 or already has Azure AD credentials. Now let's say envisionit.com was not part of Office 365, so I didn't have an Azure AD account, but it is a business email. What will happen under the scenes is Microsoft actually creates an Azure AD tenant for you, kind of in the background. It doesn't tell you what it's doing, but it walks you through a number of steps to say, well, we need to create an account for you. You have to set a password. You provide a little bit of profile information, provide some password recovery, what's an alternate email that we can use and such as part of that, and basically lets you create an Azure AD account without involving your IT organization. So you can then still accept that invitation and come in from there. It's a little bit more convoluted, but it's workable to go through that process. There's some challenges later, if the tenant does get converted to a fully managed Azure AD tenant. We've seen cases where that hasn't been well communicated and people have lost access while IT was taking over the tenant. You need to be careful around things like that. And then the third scenario is they're coming in through a consumer email address. So this is a Gmail, Hotmail, Outlook.com type of address. If it's one of the Microsoft ones like Hotmail or Outlook, you already have a Microsoft account in the background and you just sign in with that. Let's say it's a Gmail or your local Rogers, ISP providers, things like that. Those are all considered consumer emails. If you don't have an associated Microsoft account with that email address, you have to go through the process of signing up and creating a Microsoft account before you come in. So that's a little more challenging depending on who your audience is. I mean, most business-to-business portals, the first two scenarios are going to kick in, but we still see scenarios where your partner's just a small 1 or 2 man shop, and all they have is Gmail accounts. They don't have their own business email domain. They're going to have to create Microsoft accounts in order to work with you from that point of view. So let's go through some of the out-of-the-box experiences and what that looks like. So I'm going to flip over to one of my browsers here. So I got a couple windows open here. And where do I want to go? I want to come to my Demo 1 site. I created way too many sites earlier today, so I'm trying to keep track of where they all are, and I'll show you some tools we've built to improve on that experience. Okay. So let's say I come down into my document library on my team site here. You notice I started in Classic, I flipped to Modern. I do need to be in the Modern experience to see the modern sharing that we're going to be talking about here. So here I've got a folder called Demo. And what I want is I want to create an anonymous link that anybody can just dump files into that folder. So I select that folder. I can either click the Share or Copy link. They actually do pretty much the same thing here. And it'll bring up a dialog. It says, okay, well, who do you want to share it with? Well, first off, I don't want it for just Envision IT staff. I actually want it for anyone. So you can see here the 4 different choices that we talked about previously in the slides. And we're going to start with the first scenario where anyone can work with that link. Now I've set the checkbox to allow editing, and I've set an expiry for this Friday on it. I can override those values and say, you know what, I want to make it a different date in there. It's entirely up to me. Maybe we'll give them through the weekend till Monday to work on that. I go ahead and apply that. And I have the choice of either going right to Outlook to generate that email or say, you know what, I just want to copy that link. So if I want to put this into my own email, so let's come back over to my Outlook for a minute. And I'll just create a new email. If I paste that link in there, whoops, I need to copy it first. Lost it. Here, let me go through that again. Okay, we're going to do anyone, apply, copy link, and copy, and paste that in. So you end up with this big, long, somewhat ugly looking link, but the reality is that anybody who has this link now has the ability to drop whatever files they want or edit any files that are in this demo folder here. So let me take you through an example of what that looks like. So I'm going to open up a brand new incognito window. So I'm not signed into anything, and I grab that link that we've got, and I paste it up in the browser here, and you'll see it's taking me right into umdemo.sharepoint.com, which is Office 365. It shows me as a guest contributor. It doesn't know who I am, so you're not going to be able to tell who drops the files in here, but I can create new files, I can upload, I could edit documents that are in here. So let's say I was to take the actual PowerPoint for today's presentation. I can just drag and drop that right in there. Boom, it's uploading it, and now we've uploaded that document. So let's say you've got the scenario where you need a client to send you a really big file, maybe you're a creative agency, you know, it's a 200 meg zip file of all your creative assets. It's not going to go as an email attachment. It shouldn't go as an email attachment. You can send them a link to a folder, say just drop the files in here. So think of Dropbox. You know, this is sort of Dropbox for Office 365. I can then work on those documents right there. As long as I've got that link, I can pass it around to anybody. And then I could choose to pull those documents out from there. Now that link is going to expire when the date arrives, or I could go back in, you know, and actually expire it early if I wanted to say, hey, I've got the document, I don't want to leave this open, I'm just going to shut it down and close it out from there. So, you know, those sorts of scenarios where you've just got large amounts of documents, large files, things like that you need to move back and forth. Email is not appropriate. You don't want to do FTP, you don't want to set up a Dropbox. Office 365 anonymous links are actually a great way to do that. Okay, so let's go through the next scenario then to say, okay, well, I've got that anonymous link, but let's say I want to actually share it differently. I say, okay, well, I want to share with people in Envision IT and allow editing through that. So again, you know, assuming that not everybody in the organization has access to this site that I'm working in, I can create this link here. I can send it out to people, or I could just copy the link. And again, if we look back in our incognito window and try and use that link, oh, it's still got the guest access going on it as well. I was going to say that link won't work from outside people's point of view, but as long as I'm signed in using a Contoso, or in this case an umdemo account, I'll be able to access that library and any of the documents that are within that. Then let's take the third scenario where, you know what, I'm not comfortable creating a link that just anybody can use, so I don't want to use the anyone scenario. It's not people that have existing access. There's some specific people that I want to share this document with. You know, going back to my lawyer scenario, I want to share this just with my lawyer and make sure that he or she is the only person that can come in and access that. I go ahead and apply that and actually put in the names of the people that I want to invite in. So let's actually use myself as an example. And I'll type in my peter@envisionit.com. This is actually a guest account. It'll go ahead and send that out. Now I've already accepted invitations for other sharing on this site, so I don't need to go through that acceptance invitation process. I'll just get a link to the document, go in and be able to edit with it. Now only me or anybody else that specifically has permissions to this document is going to be able to work on that. So kind of three different levels depending on the type of access, whether you want to arbitrarily share this with anybody who has the link, whether you only want to share it with people within your organization, or whether there's specific targeted people both within and external to your organization that you want to share that link with. Okay. So let's switch gears and put our IT pro hat on for a minute and say, okay, well, that's all interesting, but you know what? There's stuff that we really shouldn't be sharing anonymous links to. You know, we've got confidential sites, maybe deal acquisitions that are in progress that are highly confidential, and there's no way that anybody should be able to create an external anonymous link for that. So how do we control that? How do we, you know, close it down where it shouldn't be there and open it up where it does make sense from that point of view? So there are a number of admin controls to think about from an external sharing point of view. And the things you need to think about is, you know, who's going to be able to share, so not the recipient, but who's allowed to share out to those recipients. Which external users are you going to share with? So who's the recipient side of that? What are you going to be sharing? You know, just specific sites or anything, or even files without sensitive content. There's some data loss protection integration in here where you can actually categorize documents as sensitive, and then as a result of that, not be allowed to share those out externally. And then by default, how external links are going to be used. Are they enabled, or do they have mandatory expiration dates? You block them, do you want to shut them down completely? And it's not an all or nothing. I'll show you a couple different spots where you manage this, that you can set it up fairly granularly from that perspective. There's really 3 spots to think about when you're looking to configure external sharing. And the important thing to remember is that the lowest common denominator of all of these is going to apply. If one of these 3 says disable external sharing won't work. All 3 need to agree and say this level is allowed, and it can go forward from there. So the 3 spots are the Office 365 admin portal, the SharePoint admin portal, and then within each individual site collection admin. So let's actually walk through that, give you a look at what that looks like. Okay. I'm going to shut this browser window down, get back over here. Okay, so first off, I've got my Office admin. Let's start up at the home that we've just signed into my admin portal. If I come down into my settings, I'll find a security and privacy section in here, and you notice a section here called sharing. It doesn't have a lot of granular control on here. Basically, do you want users to be able to add new guests to the organization or not? Is there a known set of external people who are already set up as external users and you don't want anybody else added to that list? Turn this off. And you can still external share with the people that are there, but users can't add new guests to the organization. Or, yeah, we're okay adding new people in there, leave this on, and it allows that invitation of net new external users in. So that's really the only thing you control from a global Office 365 tenant point of view. What you need to do from there is come down into the SharePoint Admin Center. This is the classic one. There is an updated one coming out that they announced at Ignite. I'm not running it on this particular tenant just yet. But you'll notice on the left-hand side, there's a link here for sharing as well. Now this one actually has a lot more options in it in terms of what you can do from a sharing point of view. Let me actually zoom this up because it's a little bit small and hard to read. And we'll go section by section through this. So you can define, first off, think about those 4 questions, which things, who, etc. from there, and defining what are we going to allow from a sharing outside of our organization. You could say, you know what, just don't allow it. I'm not comfortable with it. I don't want people sharing externally. I'd argue that there's certain spots in most Office 365s where it does make sense to share that, and we'll talk more about that. Or, similar to the option we saw earlier on the Office 365 admin, don't let me add new users in. I can only share with external users that already exist. Or, you know what, go ahead and let people invite net new users in, or let's go all the way and let's allow the ability to create those authenticated and anonymous links that we were talking about previously. You can force an expiry on that to say, you know what, they always have to expire. And you can also determine, should people be able to create a view and edit link, or should they only be able to create a view link? Likewise with folders as well. So again, the least common denominator, if you say, I'm only going to let you view files, then somebody can't create an external sharing link to edit files. You'd have to turn this to view and edit, and then make the decision secondarily when you share that link to say, yeah, let's edit that. Now, in terms of who, so you've got 2 decisions around how do you want to decide who's allowed to do the sharing. You say, you know what, I've got a set of security groups, and only people in those groups are going to allow doing the sharing for authenticated external users, and a second option that extends that to say only people in this second set of groups can create the anonymous link. So you can have two different sets of groups. You can see what this broader group can share links with authenticated external users, and this more tightly controlled group can also create the anonymous links in there as well. So you can start to lock that down, or you could leave this off and say, you know what, anybody's allowed to create those anonymous and authenticated external links. It's up to you as an organization from a governance point of view as to what makes sense. Now, when those links get created, what's the default there? Do we want to leave it at default and anonymous? It's probably a bad idea because people may not notice that and start sharing things they thought with specific people, and they're in fact actually sharing them anonymously with anybody who has that link. So you probably want to leave it as internal or direct as an option. You can override that when you create the link to say, yeah, I know it's direct by default, but this particular one, there's a reason I want it to be anonymous. Away we go from there. Likewise, what are the default permissions? We've set this view and edit up here, but we still may want to have it as view as the default option. So somebody has to make a conscious decision each time they share to say, no, let's change that view to edit, because that makes sense in this particular one. Now you can also restrict who you're sharing it with externally. You can say, you know what, we want to make sure that only people belonging to this particular domain gets shared with. So if you've got, say, your staff at your law firm, you could put the email domain of your law firm in there, and that's the only organization you could share with externally. You could flip that the other way around too and say, you know what, I'm not comfortable sharing with Gmail, Hotmail, Outlook.com. I want it to be business email, so I'm going to put all the blocked email domains in here and don't let people share from that point of view. You can say, you know what, if you don't own a document, you shouldn't be able to share it. And this one I think is quite important to leave checked on here. External users must accept the invitations using the same account they were invited to. What this means is if you invite me at my peter@envisionit.com, I can't turn around and accept that under my Gmail and start using it under my Gmail address, because I may leave Envision and still have access through that Gmail. That wasn't your intent when you shared that out with me. So that one I encourage you to always leave checked on. And then the notifications. We saw some of the samples in the PowerPoint deck of notification to me as an owner when somebody else shares a file, when somebody accepts it, when an anonymous link is created or updated. So if you want to be in the loop as to what's going on, leave those notifications on. So this is where most of the control happens in terms of configuring how sharing works in SharePoint Online. But there's an additional level of control at the site collection level. So if I come into site collections here, and I pick, let's say, that demo one site that we were looking at, you'll see there's a sharing option on the ribbon here. And what this does is it allows me to further restrict, to say, you know what, for this particular site, we don't want sharing. I know we allow sharing in general within our organization, but this site collection, we don't want to allow sharing. And by default, when you create a new site collection, it's set to don't allow. So the permissions aren't open by default, they're closed by default. You'd have to come in here and say, for this particular site, yes, I do want external users, or yes, I do want sharing with anonymous links through there. You can even set up separate domain rules specific to this site collection. Let's say this is a partner site and you only want people from that partner organization to be able to share into that. You can say, okay, well, I'm just going to put that partner domain in here and nobody else can accept those invitations. So again, fair degree of control around how that external sharing is set up and configured through there. All right, let me come back to the deck here. Now I mentioned Office 365 groups, and for those of you that are not familiar with groups, let me give you a quick overview on what Office 365 groups are. So if you think about SharePoint as a whole, there's the idea of personal files in OneDrive for Business, team sites, which have been around forever in Office 365 and SharePoint on premises, and then communication sites, which are more publishing site to engage and inform a broader audience. And that's an Office 365 only feature. Well, team sites have morphed. They've become Office 365 groups, and really SharePoint is only a small piece of that. The idea of the team working together is that you've got this shared space that's shared right from the start of the project, the team, whatever the context is from there. But the important thing is, as new members join that team, because not everybody starts a project at the same time. Often you have people that come in midstream, you get staff changes and such. The important thing is that as people join that team, they get the full context. They're not missing all that email dialogue that happened leading up to that point in time because it's in other people's inboxes and they don't have access to it. Policy and lifecycle is obviously important around that, and the group collaboration controls around Office 365. So if we think about all the components to an Office 365 group, communication is a big piece of that, and that can take a number of different forms. You've got Outlook, so what happens when you create an Office 365 group? It actually creates an email inbox and a calendar that you can actually CC and invite to threads through your familiar Outlook interface. Obviously, you've got SharePoint as a repository. You can also optionally use Yammer instead of Outlook from a conversational point of view within your team. You've got Microsoft Teams, which is the latest coming out. That's blending in with Skype for Business, the persistent chat, sort of the Slack style of working. So you've got a number of different choices around how you communicate within an Office 365 group. And Microsoft introduced this concept back at Ignite of inner loop, outer loop. There's a lot of confusion around, well, which of these different communication tools do we use as a team? Well, it depends on the style of that team. If you're an organization that's embraced Yammer, and this is maybe a team site or a project site that has broad application across the organization, that's your outer loop, and you probably use Yammer to do that. If it's a small group, you've got some people you work very closely with regularly on core projects, that's your inner loop. That's where Teams makes a lot of sense, using the persistent chat features from that point of view. Although a lot of people are still much more comfortable with Outlook and email, depending on the organization, you may say, you know what, we're not going to use Yammer or Teams, we're going to continue to use Outlook. So you got the ability to CC and invite from a calendar point of view into Outlook from that perspective. So Office 365 Groups makes up all of those. It's up to you individually and as a team to decide which tool makes the most sense for you. Now, external users can become part of Office 365 Groups, and they can receive emails that go to that group email address. They can access the files in OneDrive to the group site in SharePoint. They can even participate in team chats as part of Microsoft Teams and the persistent chat side of things. So they can become pretty much full-fledged members of the team. And how they get invited in is a little bit different than what I was showing you from the external sharing in SharePoint. Depending on whether they're internal or external, there's a slightly different invitation process. Let's actually go through that. I'm going to open up another of my sites here. Actually, I've got a whole list here. Let me just grab this guy. So this is a modern team site that I created. So there's an Office 365 group behind the scenes. There's a whole Outlook as part of that. And Outlook actually becomes the main vehicle for managing the members in the team. So if I come in here and I come to site permissions, it'll show me site members, site owners. So the differentiation between a member and an owner, a member has access to everything in the group, but they can't invite other people into the group. Site owners have the ability to invite net new people into the group. So when I go to invite people here, I can add members to the group, or I can just share the site itself. So remember, an Office 365 group has a SharePoint site under the hood. So if I say I want to share the site only, I'm kind of back to the same process that I saw on the SharePoint only side of things. If I say, well, no, what I want to do is add members to the group, I can click on the add members here. Now this only works within the group to add colleagues who work for my organization. So if I want to add guests or external users, I actually need to go to Outlook. So if I click on that link here, it'll actually open up my Outlook, and here we see the group conversation. So you can see up in my browser bar, this webinar demo 4 at UMDemo, that's an actual email alias that can become part of email conversations. So I'm in Outlook here where I see those conversations, and I have a link here to add members. So I click on that link, and then I could add in people from here, and they become full-fledged members of the group, and away I go from there. So a little different, but a couple choices there as to whether you make somebody a member just of the SharePoint site or the group as a whole. You may choose that I want to share certain files within the SharePoint site with those external users, but I don't want them to be a full-fledged member of the group. They shouldn't see the persistent chat or the email threads. That's just internal only. So you can actually have that separation as part of that. Okay. So I've thrown a lot out at you in terms of lots of different ways to share things, both from a traditional SharePoint Online site through Office 365, as well as from an Office 365 group. What this often comes up to is, well, how do we deal with all this from a governance point of view? What does this look like? And governance is a word that's oft overused in SharePoint, but it is an important thing to think about. And really, you want to get this right before you start rolling this out. Don't turn on external sharing for everybody, let it loose, and then when it gets completely out of control, say, well, now it's the time to put some governance in. The time to put governance in is actually before you get going into that. So make sure that your governance plan is a strong part of that it defines the roles and responsibilities, not just who's allowed to do what, but what are they supposed to do. It's intended to provide that guidance around that, and permissions is a key part of that. So if we think about just SharePoint permissions for a minute, not looking at the broader Office 365 group side, permissions can be applied at a lot of different levels. I can apply it at a site, at a list or library, at an individual folder or item level. Generally, what we encourage is apply it at the top two levels. Either create a site that everybody has access to, or a list or library within that site. When you get into item level permissions, it starts to get a little hairy and can get out of control from that point of view. I'll show you some exceptions and examples in what we're going to be showing in a minute. And then who do you apply those permissions to? Do you apply them to users or to groups? Ideally, you should apply them to groups. Groups is a confusing term these days. Is that a SharePoint group? Is it an Office 365 group? An Azure AD group? Our Extranet User Manager product has groups as well. Sorry, we're not helping to alleviate some of that confusion. But yeah, you've got to decide what a group means. And ideally, good governance says apply permissions to the groups, not to individual people. So people are going to change. So you change the membership of the group when the people change, but you don't play with the permissions. And really that brings up an important point, which is who manages the permissions in your SharePoint should really be different than who manages the group membership. If you're a project manager working on a project, you've got a team site for that, you should absolutely be able to decide who your team members are. But you want to put some controls around so that not everybody is changing the permissions on every project site. It starts to become a dog's breakfast and you just can't control that and manage what the actual permissions are. It gets out of control. So you want to tightly control the assignment of the permissions, but the business should really own the group membership. So how do we go about in doing that? I'm actually going to take you through how we do it at Envision IT. We're a consulting business. We've got lots of clients. We do lots of projects for them. The obvious thing is that we create team sites for the clients and for their projects. That's actually how we first got into SharePoint 16, 17 years ago when 2001 first came out. We needed a repository for working as a team, and that hasn't changed to today. That's still there. So what we have is a client site template that we've created. It's based off of a modern team site now, and we use the Office Dev patterns and practices to create a template of that and basically provision that automatically. And this came up from the previous webinar that I did the week before last. If you want to get into more details on that, I encourage you to check that out. We've got a couple of things in there. There's not a lot to the template. I mean, we've got the shared documents folder. Our library. It's got a couple of folders that gets shared with the client. We have a separate private documents library that's for internal use only. So things like budgets, in progress, things that we're not ready to share with the client, stay in the private documents. Stuff that should be shared, specs, any project updates, meeting minutes, things like that, all live in the shared documents. And then we leverage Extranet User Manager on top of Azure AD B2B to implement our own sharing. And we've got a nice hybrid model that leverages the best of external sharing in Office 365 with some governance and controls around that. So let's actually go through what that scenario looks like. So let me bring up our demo site. There we go. Let me actually start at this top level at the home here. So I'm in a site collection called Landing, and the idea of this site collection is it's used to manage all of our different sites that we create. And it's also used to manage the request and creation of new sites, which was the topic of my previous webinar. So what we have here is a listing of all of our different sites. Now this is our demo tenant. It doesn't have a lot in here. Actually, let me open up a slightly different one here. If I come to our home, let's say, for example, I come to our partner site. We have a whole bunch of different partners that we work with. Each of them has their own team site associated with that. And rather than just showing a list alphabetically, we've actually created a little SharePoint web part that adds in to say, well, if I want to go to a particular partner, I can go A to Z by name, pick out that partner site, jump into the site from there. But it's all driven from this SharePoint list. So let's actually come into this sites list and have a look at what's in here. Now there's a lot of fields in here. None of them are sort of back-end process. Only a few of them need to get filled in by somebody that wants to create a site. So let's actually go through the process of creating a brand new site. So I'm going to call this one Webinar Demo 5. Not very creative, but just keeping the sequence going here. Now this is going to be a modern team site under the hood. So rather than giving it a URL for the site, I actually give it an alias, and this gets used to create not just the site URL, but also the Exchange mailbox for it as well, hence the name alias as part of that. I can define a parent URL, so if I want this site to roll up under another site, let's say it's a project for a client, I would name the client site as the parent URL through there. Now I need to choose the site templates. We've got a number of choices here. I'm going to choose a modern client site. So it's based off of a modern out-of-the-box team site, but it's got our own customizations on that. And I also want to create a group for this. Now this is not the Office 365 group, this is the UM group, and I'll show you in a minute what that's all about. And we're going to make it contribute access as part of that. Okay, so that's all I need to fill in. In the previous webinar, I talked about some enhancements we could do around creating a nicer form that only captures what needs to through here. We could also extend this process to say, you know what, let's have an approval process that when somebody creates a new project site or team site, it needs to be approved before it gets provisioned, so we make sure we don't have duplicates and such from there. What I'm going to do now, though, is just go ahead and run some PowerShell that actually creates the site. The idea in a live environment is this would just be running as a background task. I've got it queued up to manually run as part of the webinar demo. And it's basically looking for sites that haven't been created, go find them and create the sites according to the template and rules. Now, it looks a little ugly. I'm not going to get into the technical details of the script. I am going to be sharing the script. That was a promise I made to the previous webinar. I've actually almost got it to the point where it's ready to share out from that perspective. Now, you would need to customize it, so you need to have some understanding of PowerShell as you look through this and say, okay, how do we make this fit exactly the templates that we want from ours? But basically what it's doing is it's spinning through and saying, go find me any entries in that list we were just looking at where the site created is null. So site doesn't exist yet, fine, go get all the details about the site. And then based on the template that was chosen, so remember we chose the modern client site, so it says, okay, it's going to use a modern team site as the base, and it's going to use this PNP template that adds our own customizations to it on top of that. So that's what it's doing right now. It's already created the team site, now it's creating the client template version of that. So it goes through and does that. It also updates that list to let it know that, hey, this site has been created. You're all good to go from there. And actually, there's one more step while this is running. It takes a little while for this to go through, is to create the Extranet User Manager groups associated with this. So remember when I created the entry in the site list, I said create an EOM group for this. And what this is going to do is run some PowerShell. So we have a whole API for our product that's going to create our group and set up all the permissions that we need as part of that. So it's going to do much the same thing. It's going to spin through and say, okay, find me anything that has an EOM group set up in it that doesn't have the group created yet for it. And it will then go ahead and provision that for us. Okay, so the site is there and created. I think the script is just about done. There we go. So let's go ahead and run the UM group script now. And likewise, that'll take a minute to go through. Let's actually have a look at our sites list here while that's running in the background. So we can see now, here's our webinar demo 5. The site was created. We got a little time zone difference there, but basically 11:47 when it was created. And I can click a link here and go over to the site and have a look at what that looks like. So as I mentioned, it's a modern team site. It's got the nice responsive modern experience around that. And we can see we've got our own customizations. We have a private documents folder that's not part of the out of the box. It's got a number of folders that we need for our business process. We've got our documents folder, again, a couple of folders for back-end processes that expects things in a particular way through there. Now let's have a look at our script here. I have a little timing thing where the group gets created and it takes a little while before I can apply the permissions. I think I've been talking for long enough to let that go. Let's see how that runs. So what it's done is it's created the Extranet User Manager group, and now it's going to break some inheritance and set up permissions appropriately in the SharePoint site. So that's gone ahead and gone through. So let's actually look at our site. So if we come in here and we look at our site permissions, and if I go to my advanced, I can get to my old style SharePoint permissions. We can see here, there's the name of the group that I created to say I want an EOM group for this site. It's considered a domain group. It's in Azure AD under the hood. And it's got contribute access because I said I wanted those group members to be able to contribute to the site. But remember the private documents, we don't want those external users to come in there. So if I come into the library settings here and look at the shared with on that and go to my advanced there, we can see that this library has unique permissions. So we've broken inheritance on the permission side, and that EOM group does not exist in here. What that means is if I invite somebody in externally, they'll have access to the SharePoint site as a whole, but they won't have access, nor will they even see that this private documents exists. So it's a nice way to manage the permissions from there. So think about my previous statement that you want to separate who gets to manage the members from who manages the permissions. We've automated all the permissions so they get applied consistently, and now all we need to do is manage the users. So let's actually flip over to my other browser and talk a bit more about Extranet User Manager. Actually, I should probably do a bit of introduction from this point of view. So what we're going to do now is step number 3 here, invite users in through EUM. So we haven't really talked about what Extranet User Manager even is. It's a tool that sits on top of not just Office 365, but SharePoint on-premises, third-party applications, and it manages users externally to your organization that you want to bring into those applications. It's got an admin console that you can delegate out to either internal businesses or even external to the organization to decide who those people are. And it deals with a lot of the things that we talked about early on in our considerations around self-registration, approvals, workflows, and such from there. The product as a whole has been around for many years, started its life as a custom-built solution for a number of our clients. And then about 5 years ago, we decided, you know what, we need to productize this. We've got too many different code bases going, add in Office 365 support, Azure B2B support, and such from there. So that's sort of the history of the product. We've got clients all around North America, Europe, Asia, Australia. So let's come back to our demo scenario with that quick intro there and come to the home of Extranet User Manager. So this is the admin console. I'm logged in as what's called a configuration editor, so I get all the options to configure the product. But if I was just say a group owner, all I would see is the ability to add and search users through here. So let's say, okay, we've got a particular group that was just created for us. I can search for that, and I can see there's my Webinar Demo 5 EUM group that we just created. So I go ahead and click on that. Right now I don't have any members in that group. So I want to add in some new members. It's the demo site. I don't have a lot of users in here, but I do have my Carson at Envision IT user in there. So I can select that user and add them into the group. So they're now a member of the group. And under the hood, this is all getting done against Azure AD, and ultimately Office 365 gets to see that as part of that. So what would happen, this is an already active user, but I just activated them before the webinar. It sometimes takes a little while for emails and things to come through. I just want to show you what that invitation email looks like. Oops. So this is what got sent to me earlier today, inviting me into the portal to say, hey, you've been invited to the UM Extranet, and this email is generated by us, not by Office 365, so we have full control over exactly what this email looks like in any branding that we want to do. I've already clicked on the invitation to accept it, and then once I've accepted, I can come back to that /site/landing to have access to my sites. Now, one of the caveats is I'm already logged into Office 365. Because I've been added to a new group, it doesn't see that. So what I'm going to do here is actually close out my browser window and take you right through the whole login process. So I start with a brand new browser session, and I click on this link to go into that /site/landing. First thing, Office 365 is going to want me to log in. So you're probably all familiar if you've seen Office 365. I need to choose the account I'm logging in with. I would need to decide if it's a work or school account. Then it takes us over to ADFS, which is where we do our single sign-on, sign into our on-premises, and ultimately get to the SharePoint Online. And you can see here now, so I'm logged in as that external user. So you can see through that I'm actually coming in through my pcarson@envisionit.com email address. And I'm seeing the same sites list, but it's actually not completely the same list. So I come back to here, and I come to my home. So now remember, I'm logged in as my staff user here, and I'm seeing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different sites in here. When I come back in, logged in as the external user that's been invited in, I only see 4 sites, because these are the 4 sites that I've been invited to. So the nice thing of this page, it's an easy way to direct all your external users to, whether they have access to one or multiple sites, it guides them in and directs them into that site. So if I click on that Webinar Demo 5, that's the new site that we just created. Boom, I'm in that user, or in that site, logged in using my own external Office 365 credentials. Now the onboarding would be a little different if I didn't have Azure AD or if I was using a Microsoft account, but the net result is the same. I end up here in SharePoint Online in that site, and you can see I see a documents library with those folders that we saw before, but I don't see private documents. It's not visible to me. I'm an external user. I don't have rights to that. So you can set up very specific rules around exactly how you want that shared out. So that gives you a quick sense of what that looks like. Let me take you back to our deck here. And I want to talk a bit about, the considerations that we talked about at the beginning of the session. The who will be accessing the extranet, that doesn't have an implication as to how you build things out. But this idea of self-registration versus invitation only is an important thing. The onboarding of large amounts of users, having some approval workflows and delegation around that makes it really important from that point of view. So we've got a couple of customer case studies I want to take you through to sort of show you examples around how that works. The first one, Associated Engineering, is still an invitation only. The problem here is that they're a consulting engineering company. They work with a lot of external parties on big external construction projects, and they needed an easy way to build up team sites in order to do that. We did a whole webinar earlier in the year on Associated. I encourage you to have a look at that if you're interested. Basically, the concepts that I just showed you, put that on steroids because you've got not just one external group, you've got multiple different external groups with delegated management of the members of each of those groups for each of those external parties on each of their projects. They've got hundreds and hundreds of external partners that they're working with. Managing that effectively became a big challenge there. So layering in our Extranet User Manager, providing that delegated management, did a lot around that. All the project site creation, we actually started that work on the Associated Engineering. What I showed you just today is kind of the evolution of that as we've continued that journey. So that's sort of one example. A second example here I want to talk about is for Ontario MD. Likewise, we also did a webinar a little earlier in the summer on Ontario MD, and the challenge here was that they needed to create a new public-facing website and extranet for about 14,000 physicians and staff across the province of Ontario. They wanted it hosted and managed. How are we going to do that? Well, we actually used Office 365 and Azure to build the public-facing site. And that's actually our next webinar. We're going to go a little deeper on that publishing side next week. But the key piece I want to talk about here is around the registration. So if I come to the OntarioMD.ca site, which anybody has access to, it's a publicly available site. Sorry, PowerPoint's just taking its time opening that link. There we go. So we can see the public site, and I've got the sign in and register links here. If I click on the register link, the goal here is we've got thousands of physicians that need to onboard onto the site. How do we validate that they are actually the correct physician? So we can use things like their Ontario Medical Association registration number, date of birth, other profile information further in this process to go through that verification and ensure that they are who they say they are. We actually use email and second factor verification later in the process. We use phone and text message as part of that. So physicians can basically self-register and then they can sponsor their staff through an invitation process to come in. So rather than Ontario MD inviting, it's actually the physicians they're inviting. So think of a physician invites typically their office administrator, and they actually delegate their office admin as a admin in the Ontario MD extranet. That office administrator can then invite in all the nursing staff and all the other folks within that practice. So it becomes a very scalable way to roll out that registration process. Third one I want to cover off quickly here is for the Ontario Association of Children's Aid Societies. The challenge here, they got about 50 plus member organizations. The site is hosted in SharePoint, and they needed a way to onboard those users very quickly. They had some provincial funding that came through. At its peak, we were onboarding about 500 new users per day, which is a lot of accounts to provision and people to get into not only Office 365, but desire to learn from a training point of view as well. So if we flip over to their site for a second, let's see here, I need a new incognito window. Their site is interesting because when you go to, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so the OCAS scenario is interesting because it brings up its own custom login form. We've actually extended and gotten away from the Microsoft login form for their scenario. You can explore it yourself if you go to ocas.sharepoint.com, come into the registration link, and you'll see the auto approval actually based off of email domain. So if you come from the right email domain, it just auto approves your account, and away you go from there. Okay, so just wrapping up last couple of things, coming back to that OCAS scenario, how will your extranet users authenticate? I mentioned that Microsoft Account and Office 365 Azure AD are really the only two ways out of the box in Office 365. We're actually extending that. Like I showed you in the OCAS scenario, we can do an email and password. Through that, we're actually adding new features later this year to even provide the ability to use Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter to come in without requiring subscription and access your Office 365 site as an external user. Microsoft's adding the Google support. They're likely going to add the more social later, but that's still coming down the pipe from them. I think we're going to beat them out of the gate from that point of view. So I think I'm pretty much out of time there. As I mentioned, we're going to put the slide deck up on the site. There's some licensing information around the product itself, some wrap-up points to think about. Where would you leverage out of the box? Where does it make sense to build more process in through there? As I mentioned, we're going to be doing a follow-on session next week on the publishing website side. We're also going to be at conferences in Chicago in December, DC in March, and the big Las Vegas SharePoint conference in May. So if you're going to any of those, absolutely come check us out. We're going to have booths through there. So we are officially at the top of the hour. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. Thank you for attending, and looking forward to continuing conversations from there. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day.